Hey everyone, welcome back to Shutter Magazine. I'm Dustin Lucas, and today I'm going to be continuing my 7-part series, How to Step Up Your Lightroom Game. This is part 5, talking about creative editing. So now that we're done with the culling and the color correction, it's time to get creative. So we can show off our best work, like some of these images I have here open in Lightroom, and we can start to get creative. I love this part of the editing. This is what I strive for. This is where I want to get done with the culling, I want to get done with the color correcting, the proof level stuff, and I want to show off my best work. So in Lightroom, as we know, it's a very powerful tool. I want to go through some ways that you can take this powerful tool and utilize things like local adjustments, brush work, right? So we all know about the basic panel, the sliders, the adjustments, that non-destructive editing workflow. But there's some things to really make your subjects pop and stand out. Things like local adjustments, dodge and burn, the radial filter, I'm going to show you some cool techniques with. But beyond brushes, there's a really awesome feature in Lightroom Classic where you can build custom color profiles. So it's a way to fully color correct your image and then apply a profile that doesn't change any of your sliders but shifts it tonally, creatively, color grades, and things like that. It's a really awesome feature to take some of those actions maybe that you purchased or built in Photoshop and show them off in Lightroom with one click. Beyond color profiles, there's the ability to work in Photoshop and Lightroom, right? So I'm going to show you the way to edit in Photoshop so your files export or create copies, open up into Photoshop immediately. You can edit in Photoshop if that's where you're a little more comfortable doing the dodging and burning stuff. You can do that, bring the images back into Lightroom, work on those copies, and even stack that file on top of your RAW. So let's start with the local adjustments and dive into dodging and burning. All right, now we're ready to jump into local adjustments, and more specifically, I want to talk about how we can utilize a dodge and burn technique to really make our clients pop. So you can take an image like this that's been color corrected, and you can take it from the before to the after, right? And that's all just in my dodge and burn technique here. So what we can do is we can start by jumping into the radial filter. You can hold shift and hit the M key and it automatically opens up this panel. Now I'm going to go ahead and reset the work I've done so that way we can kind of start from where we went, right? So this image is pretty bright in the background. It's really hard to kind of zone in on our main subjects here. So I want to start by making sure we can kind of have our exposure back to where we shot it, right? I kind of like the background dark like this, but I want to dodge them. So if I want to take that a step further, right, we can make sure we adjust the exposure to where they look good, and then we can burn down that background. So let's jump into the radial filter, click and drag, and just show kind of how this tool works. So naturally what it's going to do is it's going to apply the effect within this circle, right? But what I want to do is click on the invert key so that way it applies it to everything. Excuse me. Let's make sure we're on the downside here. So I want to make sure it's only being applied on the background, right? So if we invert it, it's going to bring it, it's only going to darken on the inside of our circle. So the way that I like to use this is making sure that our subjects here kind of utilize a little more of a dodge technique, but we're really just burning down the background and masking them out, right? So we want to make sure they're fully inside of this brush here so that way we can start to apply our effect. So we can burn down the background, we can add some clarity to really give it some definition. We can even warm it up a bit if we think it's a little cool, which kind of helps with that background, and maybe even desaturate it a bit, just so it kind of has a little more of a dullness and we're not focusing on the background. Well, this is great and all, except the fact that it's applying to our main subject as well. So what we can do is we can use our brush tool, and we can come in here and we could start to add, actually, well, we want to start to subtract from her dress. So we want to make sure we're selecting on them, making sure nothing's being applied on them. We can zoom in, of course, and you want to make sure you're working on your original, even if you have smart previews, but you want to make sure that you have the ability to zoom in one-to-one. But what you can do now is you can start to paint even closer to them and make sure this image has a little better of a masking technique. You can see that I have my auto mask turned on, so we can see how well that's going to work by hitting the O key, and we'll see if it'll just kind of mask them out. Doesn't seem to be doing that great of a job. with the auto mask, so that's all right. We can just make sure we're applying it as we need to in here and just kind of darkening the background. Now we can take our remove tool, make sure auto mask is turned off. I'm holding the option key, by the way, and I can start to apply this effect to make sure it goes away. Now, sometimes it's kind of hard to see that mask in the background. We can go up here and change our mask overlay right here. If you want to do green instead, that might be a little more useful, to where we can make sure that we're masking off on our main subjects. Now, I usually kind of use this as a starting point, but just to make sure everything looks good, I'll hit the O key so that way it goes away and I can just kind of focus on how this image looks with the effects or not applied. So this is where, I mean, there's some time-saving techniques for sure. You can use range masking, but I mean, this is where you kind of have to spend the majority of your time, especially when you have subjects that are further away, but that you want to kind of mask them out. We're just going to kind of take some time, you know, to properly apply that mask to make sure they look right with the effect. But once you have this mask done, you can apply multiple effects and things like that. But what I really like to do is kind of focus on burning down that background and making them pop a bit. Now, of course, we can duplicate, which is pretty cool. So once we get our mask done here, let me kind of finish this off. Make sure it looks right. Pretty happy with that overall. Make sure they're not glowing. And so what we can do is come in here, right click and do duplicate, which we can then come in let's make sure when we're duplicating we invert. Let's see. Sure, we're clicked on that. Invert. Raising our exposure. Our mask seems kind of throwing that one away. Here we go. Let's burn that back down. Probably better off to just do an adjustment brush tool to dodge them back out, since our adjustment here is about done. Come back into our brush and kind of mask that off. So didn't mean to get a little long-winded here on the on this adjustment here, so we can kind of move on. But what we can do is, and looking at our image, let's go ahead and set that to auto. So now we can kind of see the big difference between just applying that effect. And of course, if you know, we need to make sure we don't have any haloing going on, it's always good to zoom out, kind of make sure we apply that effect to make sure they pop just right. But I think that's pretty massive considering where we started and where it ends. So it always kind of helps make sure to do your exposure on the entire image to make sure you're exposing for your main subject. I think that can be super helpful. And then you can burn that background down. I like that a lot. So let's move on to a different type of adjustment here. We'll do a gradient filter on a sky. All right, so when it comes to a gradient filter on the sky, it's going to be a lot easier for us to choose our range mask based on color, right? Because the sky is going to be blue here, and we can sort of mask out everything else. So with the gradient filter, you're going to want to click and drag in the direction you want the gradient to go. So the longer or the wider that we have the gradient, that's where it sort of stops at the top line and gradates down here below. So you don't necessarily have to have a large amount of gradient in this effect, but we want to make sure the middle of the line hits the horizon line here. So what we can do now is hit the O key, and you can see that it's applying the effect to the entire image. So if I darken this down, this will kind of help us see that it's being applied to the entire part of this image. So if we choose to use range mask color, we can grab our color picker or color selector, hold shift, and we can start to click on blues to add different color, right? So Something you want to keep in mind as we're adding this gradient is what's being applied and where it's not, right? So the majority of this sky is selected for our mask, but we don't necessarily need to put that effect on there. It is going to be helpful for us to zoom in. Like if you want to add a bunch of clarity, you have to make sure to keep in mind around your edges. It's going to start to get kind of halo-y there. We don't necessarily have an HDR sky, so I don't think we need to add any clarity or texture there. But what we can do is apply maybe one of our presets here. Something that we want to do, maybe, oh, I don't know, saturation. Kind of boost saturation pretty quickly. We can also increase the contrast, and that might make our sky a little too blue, which we can take the saturation back down, maybe even take the contrast down a bit. We can drop the highlights to kind of darken our sky, increase the whites to add a little more density, and maybe even cool the sky down just a bit. So that can kind of give us a nice little boost with the sky only. And we can do the same thing for them or architecture. So what we can do is we can jump into another image, take an image like this, and kind of apply a very specific adjustment to just the architecture, right? So let's go ahead and start with clicking on a few adjustments here, get rid of those, and we're going to drag upward. And the difference being here is we only want the architecture to be selected. So we can try and choose color if it's going to let us. Choose only this structure, which does a pretty good job. That kind of makes our adjustments wider. But at least it gives us a pretty good starting point to now kind of come in and mask out. Now if we take the amount slider down, it does a pretty good job to get rid of the trees as well as some of the sections of them that we don't really want applied. Now, bigger issue is that a lot of her dress is being applied. So if we try luminance, possibly, we can bring down, let's see here, we can bring down those bright tones, bring down the dark tones to see if we can capture just the building. And that's not really helping either. So in a case like this, it might be even easier to use the adjustment brush. So if we hit the K key, we choose auto mask. Let's see here. As we're applying this, it does an okay job of applying this just to our architecture, right? It's not perfect by any means, but we can go in and erase any of these sections as well that are kind of getting burned by this thing. So definitely different tools. Of course, the adjustment brush kind of works a little bit better in this case for us to now add some clarity and some texture to kind of add a little more of an HDR look to that building behind. Now, in my opinion, I think that that kind of pulls away from the subject a little bit, so we might want to take our exposure down, burn that down as well. But it kind of gives a cool effect to that background. And this is something where I maybe come in with the radial brush as well. Nice little spotlight on them. Invert turned off. Just something subtle. And then we can drag just that section down. And maybe even come in here with the brush. Get rid of the brush off them. kind of helps. Just add some subtle details in there as well as his shoe, and we can kind of bring that whole thing down a little bit further so we can kind of see, oh, not that far. So we can kind of see real quick the difference between there and there. And it's just a nice kind of subtle move there. So let's move on to the skin softening portion to look how we can mask on some of that as well. All right, so now we can jump back into the adjustment brush again and paint on for some skin softening. Now, of course, it's going to help to be zoomed in on an image like this, but we can kind of take the skin from here, which isn't bad, but there with just a little more of a softening effect, right? So first thing I want to do, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of my previous pins, is I can go in and start painting with my soften skin preset here. And if I have auto mask turned on, it kind of helps mask out the eyes and lips as well as the eyebrows. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my mask on here so you can kind of see how good of a job this does. It's not really masking out the eyebrows as good as I want, but it does an okay job. Just grab the skin and apply it as such. Now, if there's areas of the face that's not applying correctly, we can turn auto mask off and of course come down here and add some softening into here as well. Don't necessarily need to soften the same amount on the neck just because it's out of focus, but you get the idea. So we'd come in and kind of mask this entire area. I'd want to probably come back in, come off the eyebrows, of course. Kind of mask those areas out, same way here. Don't necessarily need to go that far. And then kind of back into here, and that's fine enough for now. So if we turn off our effect there, we can kind of see before and after of how well that does. Now, in my opinion, I kind of like taking the texture down because it doesn't mess with the contrast of the face. So we take that down to -50. It just adds a nice subtle softness. If we take it all the way down to 100, I think that's a little too much. Somewhere in there looks right. But it does just add a nice little difference. And I can drop the highlights down a little bit. That'll kind of help even out the skin. Some of those brighter spots. Open up the shadows a little bit too. Can just add a nice kind of skin softening effect. Super subtle. And I would do the same thing to the for the eyes, right? I'd come in with the eyes and use my iris enhancement. Come in and enhance the iris a little bit, as well as I think the eyes are pretty bright and look okay. I could come in and paint on the lips as well, but you kind of get the idea of what we can do with the skin softening here directly in Lightroom, which just adds a nice softness and just kind of evens out that light on the face. I think that makes beauty portraits like this stand out a little bit more. All right, so let's move back into the creative section of this article and talk about color profiles. So something new in Lightroom Classic and Adobe Camera Raw is it gives you the ability to create custom color profiles, right? So color profiles, which you've all used, Adobe Color or maybe Adobe Standard is what you're more familiar with, but you have different profiles that you can apply, whether you purchase third-party ones or use other Adobe or camera matching ones, which I don't think work too well. But if I want to take an image like this, where I would have color corrected it to there, you'll notice that none of my sliders here shift and change, right? So none of my tone curve, none of my basic panel sliders are changing. It's literally just the color profile, which is pretty awesome. So it creates that kind of non-destructive editing where it doesn't shift my sliders. I do a bunch of adjustments for color correction, and then I want to apply my creative effects on top of it. Color profiles are the way to go. Here's how you can create one, right? So what you'll need to do is you'll need to open up a raw file, either directly into Camera Raw or open up a file into Photoshop to apply maybe some actions that you've already created. So what I want to do is I'm going to do Show in Finder, and I'm going to take this file and I'm going to open it directly into Photoshop. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'll show Photoshop 2019, let that open up. Now, if you've already got actions you've purchased or created, you got to keep in mind for this process, adjustment layers are only going to work. So what does that mean exactly? Well, let's go ahead and just open this up. Adjustment layers are not pixel based. They're not image layers. See right here, this background layer is considered an image layer. If I wanted to apply one of my workflow, let's see here, creative, I'll apply my, let's see here, warm and matte. So this action has a high pass layer, which won't work, so I'll have to get rid of that. But all of these other adjustment layers will export out correctly for this process of what we want to do. So keep in mind this kind of matte warm look that we want to apply kind of gives the image this rosy kind of warmer day. I think that's a good fit for this image. So once I kind of have my adjustments, my layer adjustments applied, and of course if you want to apply your own, just to keep in mind, let me turn this off. If you want to do some quick ones, like you want to create a gradient map, and maybe you'd like to do a black and white, right? Just a quick way to do a black and white in Photoshop with the gradient map, which is just kind of a nice option to choose. You can also do like a black and white layer and change it to luminosity, which kind of gives you a cool bit of a contrast boost, something like that. There's of course multiple ways that you can apply different layer adjustments, but it's very important that you have this, that you have layer adjustments applied. Now, once we're ready to save this, we just need to export out as a LUT, and that process is very simple. So once we have the layer adjustments applied, we'll go ahead and we'll go to File, Export, Export Color Lookup Table. Now keep in mind we want this all to kind of follow the same thing, so I'd call this matte warm. I'll leave all of these adjustments as they are. Cube file is what we need, but we're going to choose, we want the description to be the same name as our action. I just think that keeps everything the same. We'll do the same thing here. Matte warm. And we can choose for this to save in a multitude of places. I usually put those there, put my LUTs. I already kind of have matte warm, so we're going to call this matte warm 2. We'll hit save. So it's going to export that out for us. So now we can go ahead and we'll do a quick open this up in the Camera Raw filter. Once this file opens up for us, let's see here. Not sure what's happening. We'll go ahead and hit cancel. We'll go ahead and quit that. And we'll open this file back up into Photoshop because we have to access Camera Raw. It's very important. In order for us to create the color profile, we have to do that in Camera Raw. So once we open up this file again, now keep in mind if you want maybe a preset that you have applied that you want to create a LUT out of that, we can do that as well. It's pretty simple to do. So if we have a preset that you want to apply, which let's go ahead and reset this image. Go ahead and, we'll do that. We'll go ahead and reset the image back to there. And we can go ahead and maybe we want to apply a cool kind of starting point effect. Let's go back here. That has a warm 2 profile. That's not necessarily what I want. Let's see. What would be a style? Maybe I want a Fuji style to be applied to my image, right? So if I want a Fuji profile applied, what I can now do is I can save this as a profile as well. So if you don't have an action, of course, you're not out of luck for color profiles. If you have Lightroom actions that you want to apply and do that same sort of thing so the sliders aren't changed, you can do that as well. So if we can go ahead and we'll create a profile, we'll hold Option and click on the Create New Preset section, and we can call this Fuji 160. We'll do user profiles, and what it'll do is it'll save the specific adjustments that we applied, which is perfect. We'll keep all of this, all these settings the same. I'll go ahead and click OK. So it's going to create a profile for that. Now we're going to create another one, and I'm going to make sure to uncheck these because I don't want those to be applied. And I'm going to load my lookup table. So we'll click on that, and we're going to choose the matte warm 2 that we created. We'll click load. And so this is going to allow us to load the Photoshop action that we exported out as a LUT. I want to make sure all those are undone. Let's call this matte warm 2 so everything follows suit. Let's put matte correctly. We'll go ahead and click OK. And that's it. So now once we reload Lightroom, let's go into where I want to go, October, Lightroom. And now when I go back into this image, I can choose to apply whatever profile I want. So let's go back to Adobe Color, and we'll click on these profiles here. We'll click on Browse, and we'll go all the way at the bottom, and now our Fuji 160 is there. So we want to apply that cool kind of Fuji 160 look on top of our image. It's done. So it doesn't mess with any of our sliders here. It does everything we want it to do. And now if we want to decrease that effect or even increase that effect, we can do it pretty simply. Like, honestly, the color profiles are very versatile and make it super simple once you set them all up. Now that we have the matte warm, boom, now we have that same, let's go back here. Go ahead and hit done. Let's see. Let's do a little comparison here. I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel. And I'm going to do show in Finder so we can take this file, open it back up into Photoshop. What are my settings? Let's save that. Let's see here, load settings. No, don't want to do that. Well, let's do it the long way. This should be good now. Go ahead and open this back up into Photoshop, just so that way we can see a comparison of the profile applied in Lightroom versus what it looks like in Photoshop. Now, it probably will vary a bit, but it shouldn't be too different. Of course, I don't have the high pass turned on. So now we can go to our matte warm and see how similar those are, comparing that in Photoshop versus Lightroom. So pretty awesome to be able to apply that, as well as the Fuji profile, which I think works out pretty good. But you also have, what's awesome is this amount slider. So if I want to tone that back, I can, just so that way my image can kind of go from here. Let's make sure we have a true before and after. Let's go ahead and hit reset. That way we can kind of see the before and after there. So pretty awesome to be using the color profiles. Again, if you want to apply this to multiple images, which I really like if we want all of our images to have that same look, now we can do it super fast. And we can see what that looks like on all of our images. Now that looks terrible. I don't know what happened there. That's not an edit I was going for at all. Let's go ahead and sync those now. Kind of fix that. So there we go. Let's go back and apply our matte warm, sync, treatment, and profile. And now all of our images can have that effect applied to them, and do what we need to. Now, of course, if you want to be able to utilize the organization and kind of proof level editing that you can do in Lightroom, but also take your image into Photoshop, there's a pretty awesome edit in feature that you can use as well. So checking on our preferences, there's the external editing option, and you can choose the file format, the color space, the bit depth, all this stuff when you're editing from Lightroom and opening up a copy of it into Photoshop. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I am going to right click on my image and choose the edit in Photoshop, right? You can also do, I think it's Command E, and that will automatically open up your image into Photoshop as well. So in a case where we've already kind of applied our color profile here that we're pretty happy with, there might be maybe a workflow action set that you can't necessarily apply as part of a color profile. Like maybe more specifically you like to use portraiture, which is perfectly fine, to use in the background. If we want to invert that and just have it applied to her face, we can make sure portraiture is applied, things like that. Kind of makes sense to use certain things here in Photoshop more specifically. So in the case that we'd want to come in here and maybe do some dodging and burning, that's another option. You want to kind of brighten his face up a bit, as well as hers. We can do that pretty easily. So you have different kind of let's see here, let's invert that, and we can and dodging them out, things like that. Different kind of different techniques that we'd want to apply to our image, right? So in the case of an image like this, just do something real quick here. If we wanted to do our dodge and burn here in Photoshop, we can. Works out pretty well. Any kind of, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of quit that. You know, it's something if we just want to do a real quick. Just kind of burning down the background there super fast. Nothing too crazy. Just kind of add some emphasis there. Now, in the case where we'd want to bring in maybe, I don't know, some high pass to add a little more sharpness to our image here, we can bring that back up. Even change the soft light to overlay to make it stand out a little bit more. Now we can take this image, save it, and quit Photoshop, and it's going to show up right next to our raw file. So now we have our TIFF that we were working on in Photoshop saving right next to the raw file. Now depending on how fast your computer is, and as you can see mine has a little bit of a lag here, but you can see those differences, and it's just kind of building that standard profile. Here are your comparisons, right? So here's the raw file with our color profile applied, and this is what it looks like in Photoshop. So a little more photo editing ability, of course, between there. Now, from an editing standpoint, you likely wouldn't want to show the raw edit versus the TIFF file. So you can come in here to Preferences, and under the external editor, you can choose Stack with Original. So it automatically will stack this on top of the other image. So next time when we take an image out and we do Edit In, we'll choose Adobe Photoshop, just real quick here. And once we apply our different adjustments that we want, let's go ahead and just do our creative, apply. And a high pass. Just to kind of see differences in those. Let's see. Just a real quick dodge and burn, maybe white recovery, wanna fix the dress a little bit. Kind of lost a lot of detail there. So now that we have that kind of taken care of, we can hit save, like we had done before, quit, and now it's stacked on top. So that way it puts your original file on. So if you have your stack turned on, if you have stack set up, this would be the only file they would see, would be that final edit one in from Photoshop. So definitely a great tool for edit in Photoshop, and makes it simple and organized to keep your files in Lightroom. That's where they should stay, but you can also use the power of Photoshop to export into. All right, there you have it. So now that we have the best of the best images chosen, we can let loose our creative side. So when it comes to Lightroom, I'm always starting out with the local adjustments and brushes just to see if I can do a quick dodge and burn to really make my main subject or my clients pop, right? We always want to make sure that they are the center of attention, and we kind of create that through different editing techniques. Color profiles. If you haven't tried these, if you've been resisting these for a while, I urge you to try them out. Color profiles are a game changer for creative editing in Lightroom. I mean, the fact that they don't change your sliders, if you're using presets in Lightroom, if you're editing in the basic panel, of course, for color correction, you're not going to want to apply a creative preset on top of that to change all of your sliders to now have to re-edit. That's crazy. And it doesn't really make sense to make all 800 images look like kind of bastardized creative edits either, right? You want to kind of have some differences. You want to have something that's color corrected and proof level, but create that desire, that distinction with the creative edits, so that way they're buying products from you. Don't just give your creatives away. Choose the best images, apply those effects, and spend your time there. What I really like is the ability that now you can take actions for Photoshop. So many of you that use Photoshop have maybe purchased actions or just work that way for creative edits. You can now kind of take your actions and see what they look like on your images in Lightroom, even at a proofing level, right? You have your clients coming in for the IPS and you want to show some creative edits on top of the color correction. Well, now you can do it with one click. That's huge, right? You don't have to spend all this time editing in Photoshop and applying actions and waiting for your computer to save. You can click on them immediately in Lightroom. For those of you who like to work in Photoshop and really like to take images and use your plugins and things like that, that's what the edit in Photoshop or the external editor is for. So you can definitely use that to still keep things organized, managed in Lightroom, which I urge you. You should always start in Lightroom and end in Lightroom. That's where your files should be kept. But that's it. Keep in mind, next month I'm going to be talking about in my part 6 of my part 7 series, how to step up your Lightroom game, finalizing your files. So I'm going to go through renaming your files, reordering them, export presets using droplets so you can apply automation in Photoshop. But also talk about like image processor and different automation techniques in Photoshop as well, and much, much more. Tune in next month, and I have a lot more for you.